Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Rowan Tonkin and I'm Head of Sales and Marketing Solutions here at Anaplan. It's my pleasure to be hosting today's webinar with our partner ZS Associates. Today's webinar will last approximately 45 minutes. Today we're going to be talking about how to create personalized incentive plans that increase motivation for individuals and encourage desired sales behaviors. I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Marley, Principal at ZS Associates. Steve is a thought leader in incentive compensation and is renowned for helping companies create and optimize compensation plans, designing quota plans, and implementing key sales administration programs. He has co-authored a number of books on sales compensation, including The Future of Sales Compensation. Today we'll be giving away his most recent book, Sales Compensation Solutions. 3 lucky winners will be chosen today at random, and you must be virtually present to win. The winners will be announced at the end of the Q&A portion of this webinar, so please be sure to stay on. Feel free to submit your questions throughout today's webinar in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the webinar. Steve, thanks for joining us, and I'll let you take over from here.
Perfect. Thank you, Rowan. Thank you for the introduction and welcome to everyone on the webinar. Certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us today. As Rowan mentioned, I work in the sales compensation space and I lead the SPM partner software practice at ZS, working with companies like Anaplan to implement and support technology solutions. The basis for this webinar is really twofold. The first is some recent research conducted by ZS around generational preferences in sales compensation plans. And the second is feedback that we've received from companies that we've spoken with, we've worked with, and companies that we've interacted with at various conferences and trade shows to understand what are the key and pressing items in the sales compensation world right now. And there are some themes that we've been hearing around this topic of personalized incentives that we're going to delve into a little bit more detail today. And we're going to approach this from 2 perspectives. The first is, why are personal incentive or personalized incentives important, number 1, and then number 2, what are some of the ways that companies are approaching the personalization of their incentive plans to maximize the motivation of their sales organizations? So to start, I think we can focus on what are some of the external change forces that are impacting sales organizations. And at a very high level, there's 3 that I'd like to point out. The first is the digital revolution. So that is the rise of the internet, mobile computing, mobile technology, and certainly big data. These things are enablers for some of the changes that we're seeing. And while companies can certainly benefit from these technological changes, I believe the bigger change is really on the side of the customer. So the middle picture is referring to the fact that customers are now more informed than they've ever been in their past. And this digital revolution is the driving force behind some of that. So as an example, when was the last time you bought something without going on Yelp or Angie's List or TripAdvisor and looking up a review to understand what are the product features and what are the reviews, what are people saying about the service that you might receive here? This is not atypical, I think, to myself, but I've spoken to various salespeople, and probably the most recent example is an auto dealer, where I actually believe I knew more about the specifications of the car than the person on the lot was, because I did a lot of research in advance. And in fact, the corporate executive board did a study a few years ago and found that 57% of purchasing decisions are actually made before a salesperson is ever involved. So people are finding information on their own right now, and I think this influences the way companies look at their go-to-market strategies. This also factors into the third picture on the screen, which is increased competition that we're seeing. Companies really have to rethink their approach to how they attract and retain customers. The barriers to entry because of technology are often lowering, they're coming down, and that there are customers and incentives that need to be in alignment. So the most pronounced example I could probably give in the news recently is Uber. So if we think about some of the struggles that Uber has been going through around their culture and around the way they even treat their employees versus some of the other ride-sharing services like Lyft that maybe have a better reputation or a different reputation in the market, some of those are being enabled by technology, social media. People are sharing their perspectives, and it's causing customers to maybe switch allegiances and move to other alternatives. So the impact and the influence of these factors are sales incentive programs at a very high level are becoming more complex, and the driving factors behind that complexity, first is there's more complex selling environments. So if we think about the auto example that I gave before, salespeople are no longer just communicating product features. There's oftentimes that type of sales role is being displaced by technology. People are finding that on their own on the internet, and there's a recognition that there's a more highly skilled salesperson that often needs to be involved in the process. We're often seeing that in the rise of different roles and different functions in organizations, roles such as key account managers, CAMs, for example, that are coming into the mix. The second item that I think are the implication of these external forces is the attribution of sales is becoming more difficult. In these types of selling environments, if we think of something like the high-tech industry, as they've moved from on-premise software solutions to subscription-based software solutions to, the latest is now looking at consumption models, for example. When you have these types of consumption models, there's questions around at what point in time do we realize the sale and who is responsible for driving that business? Is it the person that is locating the customer? Is it the person that's signing the contract? Is it the person that's pulling through or driving some of those consumption level metrics? That makes it a little bit more difficult to determine how and who we pay on some of these sales. The third factor is what I would call challenging crediting assignments. So who is going to get credit for any given sale? This is particularly pronounced in more complex selling environments where there's often teams of people that are involved. There's multiple people that may be involved in the sale to different degrees, and how do we decide how to credit them? Is it a double counting of the credit? In many cases, there are 4, 5, 6 people in a team that are participating to different degrees in the sale. Do we all count that equally? Is there some sort of split credit? Is there some apportioning? And if so, how is that done? All of these things are causing companies to rethink how we structure the incentive plans. But again, these are all what I would call external forces. They're things that are affecting the way we look at incentives, but they're outside the internal sales force and sales organization. Now, that being said, there are also what I would call internal change forces that are affecting sales organizations. And the first is behavioral economics or social psychology. So people are looking at why do salespeople sometimes behave in non-profit maximizing ways? And Dan Ariely, who is a very well-known published author in the field of behavioral economics, had a study that describes how incentives or in this particular case, disincentives can work. So he provided an example of a daycare where parents were picking up their children late, and that caused the staff to have to stay there a little bit longer than expected and watch the children while the parents came in. And so they had this idea that we are going to put in place a disincentive. We're going to charge them a fee, and whether it's like $10, $15, and if your parents were late picking you up, they would have to pay this fee. And ultimately what they found was the opposite of what was intended actually occurred. So the financial penalty for picking up kids when the parents were late gave the parents a reason or a rationale. They basically said, well, if I'm going to pay the penalty, I may as well be really late. And they found that late pickups actually increased and got worse when they put this disincentive in place, and so they had to remove it. That type of study, I think, is becoming more and more prevalent as companies look to understand how do our salespeople think and act, and is the compensation plan the only lever that we should be pulling on? The second element is generations in the workforce, and we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail a little later on in the webinar. But are the motivations the same for the younger versus the older generations? And do we need to think of them in different ways when we're designing our incentive plans? And the third is intrinsic motivations. So do we need to incentivize people if we're providing intrinsic job satisfaction? If people are just happy with the work that they're doing, do we need a sales compensation program? And so companies are thinking about these three internal change forces and basically saying, there is a new layer of complexity that we need to consider here. There are the external forces that I mentioned previously. Those don't go away. Plus, now you have this movement away from what I would call the coin-operated mentality. Now, that's not to say that this is going away completely. I've certainly worked with sales organizations where there are salespeople who still believe very strongly that cash is king. There are sales leaders that want their salespeople to be coin-operated. I've worked with sales leaders, VPs of sales, that have basically said, I love seeing the new car in the parking lot because that tells me that somebody is going to work extra hard because they have to make those payments. Many companies are looking at whether that is indeed the right model given the composition of their particular sales force. The greater focus we're finding is that companies are focused on or starting to think about what really gets people out of bed in the morning. You may have heard this in your own sales compensation discussions within your company, this comment that if we put more money on the plan, that's going to get people excited, that's going to get them out of bed in the morning. Some organizations are now saying, what else are people looking for? Is it just the cash? Is it just the money, the sales incentive, or are there other things? And so when we start talking about plan personalization and personalized incentives, we're going to deal or delve a little bit more into some of these internal forces and how they're influencing the way companies are designing their incentive programs going forward. Now, the foundation for personalized incentives, I think, begins with looking at how compensation plans are typically or traditionally designed today. And those plans are usually designed around sales roles. So this is a very high-level example, not necessarily company-specific, but imagine you have an organization that has three roles. You have an inside sales representative, a territory executive, and a key account manager. The ISR, the inside salesperson, might be the person that's working with lower touch customers. Maybe they're smaller customers, maybe they're less profitable customers, but they can be serviced through a call center or inside sales team. Then you might have your territory executive that's dealing with something between the small, medium-sized enterprises and approaching something on the border of enterprise scale. While your key account managers are the ones that are typically calling on your largest and most complex customers, the customers that maybe have a more complex selling process, something that's based a little bit more perhaps on relationships and negotiating skills rather than a transactional sale. And what we see right now is that companies recognize that those different roles require different compensation structures. So you generally aren't going to see a CAM being paid in the same way as an ISR. And that's true both in terms of the pay level, the pay mix, as well as the components that go into the incentive plan. That is what I would call the base case. Every company, I think, would recognize that different sales roles, different incentive structures. Now, when we start to consider the role of increasing levels of customization in the incentive plan, take, for example, the territory executive that I referred to on the previous page. And I think what we also see as fairly common in organizations is the customization of incentive plans, but within roles. So if you imagine these Lego blocks represent the evolution of a territory executive incentive plan, on the far left, you could say that all territory executives, all TEs, are treated the exact same. So they all have the blue plan, and the blue plan is the same for everybody, regardless of where you're located, what customers you cover. You're a territory executive. We basically treat you all the same. Now, we work with many companies that say they have 5 roles but 25 comp plans. Now, why do we start seeing those differences? It's because, well, we might have 2 territory executives with the same basic role or job description. We often see situations arise where you have local market conditions, or somebody is covering for a vacant territory, or there are unique account types that one territory executive is covering that another one isn't, that require tweaks to the plans. And What do we call these tweaks? We generally refer to them as exceptions. And so oftentimes the explosion of plans and the different number of plans relative to roles is a result of these exceptions. So we still have territory executives, the yellow blocks in the middle now, but now there's one territory executive he's got a red block, or she has a red block. It's just different. It's a different structure that's set up. And I think if there are comp administrators that are joining us today, comp administrators generally don't like exceptions. Now imagine a world where you're getting more and more complex and you're getting closer to what's on the right-hand side of the screen, which is there are yellow blocks and green blocks and blue blocks, and you have lots of exceptions. And at some point in time, are the exceptions becoming the norm? And we shouldn't necessarily treat them as exceptions anymore. So that is the basis for how we currently look at plan customization. Again, it's based on the role. There are variations within the roles, but it's still focused very much on a role-by-role difference. Fundamental to that, I think, when we're looking at the personalization of incentives is challenging the paradigm that cash is king, or that cash is always king. So you can imagine a situation on the left-hand side where we give somebody money and they're happy, and if on the right-hand side we give them more money and they're more happy. Is that always the case is the question we need to be asking when we're personalizing the incentive program. An example that I could give from a project that I worked on in the past, we were working with the head of sales. They wanted to change their plan construct. They had a plan that was in place for many, many years. It wasn't working. We offered up some alternatives to them, and they said, hey, we love the new plan idea, but if we make this change, I think we need to update the commission rate from 5% to 8% because people are going to feel anxious about this. So we need to get them excited. We need to get them motivated by giving them a little bit more money. That perspective is certainly more on the right-hand side of this slide. More money, happier employees, more motivated sales force. We wanted to question whether that was actually true, and there are some questions around the dimensions on which we can personalize incentives. And so one of the first ones we wanted to explore was this concept of how do we look at generations in the workforce? So when we have different generations, are they and should we be treating them the same? Because again, if you think of a role-based structure, everyone in that role is going to have the same compensation plan when we look at the base case. So we conducted a study at ZS. We looked at respondents who are salespeople working in the USA, and the reason we looked at salespeople is in the past, I think there have been many studies done on motivation and incentives that focused on college students or people that were working in factories, for example, doing manufacturing or assembly work. And the response is often, well, salespeople are different. Right? There's a different mindset in the sales force. So let's interview and let's survey salespeople. Our survey captured 510 responses, roughly 170 responses in equal proportion across baby boomers, Gen Xers, and Gen Y. And Gen Y is used interchangeably, I think, with the millennial group. And certainly we're starting to see the next generation, the Gen Z, starting to come into the workforce as well. They weren't captured in this particular study. They didn't have enough numbers in the sales force. Generations in the workforce, though, is an important thing to companies because it's predicted that 50% of the workforce by the year 2020 is going to be comprised of millennials, up from around 35% in 2015. So you're going to have this massive influx of a new generation, and do we want to incentivize them the same way that we incentivize older workers in the sales force? And that's what this study sought to understand. I'm not going to present all of the results here. I only have 3 findings that I want to share for the purpose of brevity. But the first is we looked at variable pay. And so if you consider how variable pay is set up, on the left-hand side is the preference. So higher on the axis means higher preference. On the far right-hand side, or the x-axis, is their preference for variable pay versus fixed pay. And so the light blue line that goes from top left to bottom right is the Gen Y, the millennials, and you can see that they have a preference for high variable pay, much lower preference for high fixed pay. If you look at the dark blue line, that's the baby boomers, they're the exact opposite. They go from a very low preference for high variable pay to high fixed pay. Some of the findings there, the baby boomers obviously prefer that high fixed component, probably a byproduct of their current age and their fiscal responsibilities. They might have mortgages that they're trying to pay off. They might be thinking more about retirement. They would prefer the guaranteed pay over the variable pay. If you look at the Gen Xers, they're in the middle. You can see the curve. It tends to be a little bit more split. Now, when you think of most sales incentive plans today, they tend to be something in the 75-25 range. That 75-25 probably appeals very much to the Gen Xers, whereas if we look at the Gen Ys, they actually prefer a low fixed component. They like to have a lot of pay at risk, and the key takeaway is that risk appetite is often higher for younger generations. Do our compensation systems currently address the risk appetite, or have we designed them in a consistent way across all of the generations because they are in a specific sales role? The second finding we have is the preference for work hours and flexibility. So I'll just take a second to explain what we're showing here on the baby boomer side. So the baby boomers, we asked folks, how much time would you like to spend working, and would you prefer that working schedule to be flexible or inflexible? So hopefully everybody can see these colors on their screens and the way they're displaying, but the teal color is non-flexible. So that would be something akin to your 8 to 5 type of job. You have office hours and you need to be there. Not surprisingly, nobody really wants to work 50 hours, but baby boomers are somewhat indifferent between 32 and 40 hours, and they're also relatively indifferent between the type of work. So whether it's flexible or inflexible. Flexible work schedules are schedules where you need to potentially put in 40 hours of work, but how and when you do that is up to you. So some people would say, I'm going to work from 12 o'clock in the afternoon until 9 o'clock at night. I don't necessarily have office hours. That would be a flexible working example. When we look at the Gen Xers, also don't really like working 50 hours. They have a slightly higher preference for flexible working time, and somewhat indifferent, again, between 40 and 32 hours. When we look at the Gen Ys, we see quite a marked difference here, that there is a much higher preference for working 32 hours in a flexible manner, the assumption being that I can be more productive in a shorter period of time if you let me work the way that I want to work. So when we talk to our sales force, are we letting the sales force dictate how to be successful in their work schedule, or are we saying, hey, here are the hours that we want you to work from a company perspective? Baby boomers generally don't benefit from flexible working hours, whereas that flexibility, I think, is very important to the Gen Y group. The third piece of studies that I wanted to show is the preference for sales contests. So we asked people what type of sales contest reward mechanism would they like, and we gave them 3 options. So the first option is 2 winners on equal prize money. So imagine this is a case where we say we're going to give $3,000 in total reward money. We're going to give $2,000 to the first place person, $1,000 to the second place person, and the third place person and below gets nothing. We also asked, what if there's 3 winners in unequal prize money? So this might be, again, with the $3,000 example, $1,500 to the first place, $1,000 to the second place, $500 to the third. And then we also asked if people would like 3 winners, equal prize money, $1,000, $1,000, $1,000. And what we see, again, the color coding is the same as it was before. The Gen Y folks actually prefer 3 winners, equal prize money. That sort of socialistic approach to contest rewards. The baby boomers, who grew up in a very independent generation and actually want more individual accountability are basically saying 2 winners, unequal prize money. This is a group that basically says, when I overperform, I want to get rewarded for it. Okay, so you can see the difference, and not surprisingly, in almost all of our survey results, we found something similar. Whenever there was a switch in direction between the Gen Y responses and the baby boomers, when they were inverse in their responses, the Gen X was somewhere in the middle. So you can see the Gen Xers are very low on the extremes and highest in the middle. Okay? So that certainly raises the question, okay, that's interesting, Steve. Now, what do we do with this? And when I've shared these results with people in the past, the question I often hear is, okay, that's interesting. What do we do with it? How do we act on this? And it's important to consider what we mean by personalization and what are some of the different levels of personalization. And I'm going to tie this back to this generational study in a second here. But if we look at the levels of personalization that we often see, I've called this level 1, level 2, level 3. This isn't necessarily intended to mean that level 1 needs to go first and level 1 is better or worse than any of the others. But level 1 is typically something that is personalization and customization options that are defined mainly by the company. So the blue on the right-hand side is the company influence, and the orange is the level of influence from the salespeople. So an example of a company-offered or company-designed incentive program that has some personalization is you might develop 2 options. Choose from plan 1 or plan 2. You can imagine how this could work with different generations. You might say, I'm going to design 2 incentive plan structures. The first one is going to be something that we believe is going to appeal more to one group, one demographic. The second option we believe is probably going to appeal to another demographic. We don't force those plans on them. We basically say, would you like plan 1 or plan 2, and let them self-select. Our assumption would be that many of them would pick the plan that was designed with their demographic in mind. But that is still very much driven by the company itself. The second, the level 2 personalization, is where the salesperson provides an input to the metric or measure from the company. An example here is choose your own quota level. And again, this is something that we've seen many companies do, usually on a contest basis. So a little less common in the base incentive plan itself, but when you're running a contest, you can basically say, hey, we're going to have a contest for the next month. You can choose a quota of $10,000, $5,000, or $2,000. And if you hit your quota, you're going to make a lot of money if you choose $10,000. You're going to make less money if you choose $5,000, and you're going to choose next to nothing or get next to nothing if you choose $2,000. So the company is basically saying it's up to you. Pick a quota value that you think you can hit, and you're going to get a reward for it, but that reward is still commensurate with the level of the quota. So that's a combination plan option or personalization option where both company and the salesperson are contributing. And then the level 3 personalization is where the salesperson is providing more direct input to their individualized sales compensation metrics and measures. So an example here might be choose your plan type. Do you want to have a high fixed or low fixed variable component? Do you want a quota, or do you want a commission-based plan? And again, what we've seen is in the generational studies, different generations have different preference levels for these types of things. So do companies offer these up to people as options? And just to get a sense from the audience where companies are right now, we wanted to have a poll. So you should be able to see the poll screen right now, and there's 4 options. So the level 1, 2 or more plan options designed by the company. The level 2 allows salespeople to influence and make decisions around the plan constructs. So that would be like pick your own quota. And then the level 3, the reward mechanism, metrics, et cetera, are open to the salesperson input. And then obviously the level 4, maybe your company hasn't started personalizing the plans yet. So if you could go ahead and click one of those radio buttons and hit submit, we'll give people a few seconds to do that, and then we'll share the results. We'll give it just maybe 10 more seconds or so. I see some responses still coming in. It looks like we have around 70–75% of the respondents have answered so far. So let me go and share the results, and certainly continue to click on that so we can track at the end if you'd like. So you can see that 2/3 of companies aren't personalizing their incentive plans yet, whereas 20%, so roughly 1 out of 5 companies, is providing some sort of plan options to the sales force. This is consistent, I think, with what we've seen. So we've definitely seen a lot of companies interested in it. Many companies haven't started down this path yet. The ones that are starting down this path are offering a limited number of options, but they still want that control. The level 3, I think, is the one that not too many companies, and none in this particular survey, have gone down this path to a great extent yet. And we're going to explore and discuss why that is as we get into the next section, which is around the challenges. So when we've had discussions with organizations around personalizing the incentive plan, the comp designers, the people on the left-hand side, say, this sounds great. I can motivate the sales force. This is very interesting. I can see how this is going to cause us to have a better engaged sales organization. It makes sense to us. The person on the right-hand side is the comp administrator. They're the person that goes running out of the room saying, how are we ever going to make this happen? And then once they come back into the room, they sort of say to us, explain to us how this is going to work. What are some of the things that need to happen to enable personalization? And when we talk about enabling personalization, we're looking at it from both sides. So we're looking at what are the things that we need to do when we're designing plans, and what are some of the things that we need to do when we're thinking about administering or operating those plans. So I'll start with the design. That's probably the easier one to discuss when we're designing personalized plans. I think the first question, and I apologize, it looks like the font got a little bit mixed up here, but first question is why? So why do we need this? And while this might be more of a how question than why, it's how will it benefit the salesperson, or why will it benefit the salesperson or the organization? So what we're not recommending is personalizing your incentive plans for the sake of personalizing the incentive plans. But if you find that you have a highly diverse sales organization, and I think one of the ones, a prototypical example we see where personalization of some type would be helpful, is when we're dealing with organizations that have a highly tenured sales force that is nearing retirement, and the folks that are coming in to replace them tend to be many years younger and of a different generation. That creates some tension because the incentive programs are often designed around the salespeople or for the salespeople that are starting to look at exiting the organization. So if you have that type of situation, it might be a good opportunity to explore the personalization options. The second one is who. And there's really two questions here. Who needs to be involved to make this work? So there's a lot of decision makers that come into the mix when you're personalizing an incentive plan. HR would need to be involved. The sales comp folks would need to be involved. The sales leaders would need to be involved. The sales force needs to be involved as well. And then there's a question of who should participate. Because there is an increasing level of complexity, is this something that you need to offer to everyone, or are there specific situations in your organization where you would benefit from applying this practice? And the last is the what. So what are the options? What are some of the personalization options that you need to consider? How do we determine those? I think depends on who is participating and what you're trying to accomplish. One of our best practices and caveats, I would say, is when designing plan options, consider the paradox of choice. And so many people are probably familiar with this term. It was coined by a psychologist named Barry Schwartz, who described the paradox of choice as a situation where when presented with too many options, there's a form of mental paralysis that takes place. And from my perspective, the example that I can provide is the first time I went to the Cheesecake Factory. And so I don't know if folks on the webinar have ever been there, but I remember sitting down, looking at the menu and thinking to myself, this is enormous. How am I ever going to make a decision? There were so many options that it actually made my selection for dinner a very long process, much longer than if there was just a simple menu with only 3 items. And ultimately, multiple choice provides challenges to people when those choices aren't seen as differentiated. So you can imagine if there was a menu that had 100 items on it and one of them was vegetarian, that's really not a difficult choice for the vegetarian to make. If there were 100 items on the menu and you could choose from every single one of them, then that becomes much more daunting. And I think comp plan design options are very similar. We want people to have enough differentiation in the options that it's clear that I would prefer option 1 over option 2 versus here are 10 options and they are so subtly gradated that a person is saying, do I want option 1 or option 2? I really don't know. And they start wondering, what if I pick option 2 and option 1 ends up being better? And so we don't want to put people into that situation. It can actually increase the stress. What we're trying to do with personalization is create a program that allows people to be more motivated, not less. So from my perspective, we would typically recommend having a limited number of options. 2 or 3 is probably a good number to start with, and ensuring that those are sufficiently differentiated that people can make decisions based on them. On the operations side, some of the things that are enabling personalization and how I try to talk some of the sales comp administrators down from the ledge that they sometimes get on when they're dealing with this level of potential complexity is consider the way technology has evolved over time. And we can look at anything from landline phones through to mobile smart devices. The example I have on the screen is if you look at the speed of the internet. For those of us who are in the Gen Xer range, most of us probably remember this concept of dial-up modems, where there was this screeching sound as you connected to your phone line to get these ridiculously low download speeds. And I've seen this same sort of chart applied to music downloads. So if you had a 4 megabyte song, how long would it take over time to download those songs? Those songs used to take hours to download. Hours. Then it took minutes to download, and now they take seconds, and in many cases less than a second to download. The technology through changes in speed, performance, and connectivity are actually allowing things that were never possible years ago. So the concept of streaming live video or streaming video over Netflix and over the internet, these high speeds are allowing us to do things that were never possible 5 years ago, 10 years ago. When it comes to sales comp and administration, we're seeing the same sort of shift. And when it comes to technology enablement, there's 2 factors that we see are really driving the ability to offer greater personalization in the incentive plan. The first is connectivity. So the connectivity really comes from the integration of the functionality that companies are looking at to drive motivation. So rather than having just standalone sales compensation systems, there are these integrated systems that have HR data, prizes, gameplay, and sales compensation is still in there, and data management is coming into the mix as well. And the ability to track and compare multiple compensation structures or plan design options, not just at the role level, but at the role person or role group level. So we have Steve, he's a territory executive. We're going to be able to track his plan and his performance and his motivation, not just at the TE level, but at the Steve TE level. And Rowan, who introduced the call, Rowan might have a completely separate plan. He might be in the same role that I am. He might be a TE as well, but there is a role TE Rowan combination as well. That is a very difficult construct in the past because these systems weren't highly integrated and connected. I think the other technology enabler that we're seeing is flexibility and the ability to make these more significant architectural changes. So what we see going away in the near future is this paradigm of systems that are built around the fundamental assumption that one role, one plan, right? For folks that are sales comp administrators or work with sales comp administrators, you probably have heard the complaints around we need to limit exceptions. Right? There is software that is starting to surface that we would say can handle exceptions with ease to the point that in the future we imagine people will look back on them and say, why was that ever a problem for folks? The exceptions are the norm. Everything is an exception because everything is individualized. Some of that comes from the fact that there's faster processing speeds and that technological advancement continues somewhat unabated, but it also comes from the way we see systems being architected in the future as well. And this is the last slide before we get into the Q&A. As Rowan mentioned, we're going to try and wrap up in 45 minutes here so people can grab their lunch or make their way to the next meetings. But when we think of the way that companies' incentive strategies are evolving over time, if we look at it around two dimensions, I think the area that a lot of folks are in right now is in this lower left-hand corner. We're looking at compensation, we're looking at sales compensation, and we're looking at it on a role basis. So this is we're going to pay all of the TEs the same. They have the same compensation program, same structure. Now, as we start to move up the complexity dimension, the breadth is let's still focus on, and compensation is probably not the right word here, it's probably incentives more than anything else. So the breadth is still limited to incentives, but now we're focused more holistically on motivation and rewards. So instead of having role-based sales compensation, we're basically saying we are going to have some type of motivation system in place. Still focused on driving motivation and incentivizing the folks, more complexity, similar breadth. As you start to move to the right, we see more integrated sales planning. If the complexity remains the same, it's still very much role-based. So we have some territory executives. Those territory executives have some territory plans, some account or some alignments that they're dealing with, some customer information. They might have some quotas. Those quotas are tied into something in the system that updates when they change their customers, but it's still fundamentally constructed around the role that they're playing. The upper right-hand corner is this corner where I don't think a lot of companies are playing yet, but certainly looking to move there, which is this integrated sales planning, a broader breadth, but it's going to increase the complexity of the incentive strategy because now companies are also looking at how do we create better motivation programs, better incentive programs, something broader than the sales compensation suite itself. There are no right answers here. As I mentioned, I'm certainly not suggesting that you need to be in the top right-hand box. What we are seeing, though, is companies are considering, should we be in that right-hand box? Maybe we're in the lower left-hand box. Maybe we're in the lower right-hand box. How do we better engage and better utilize our sales force? And that's ultimately the end goal of the personalized incentives. So I'm going to pause there and open it up to questions. I think Rowan has been tracking and monitoring those. So Rowan, if there's some specific questions that we can answer, I'm happy to take some of those now.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And for those that have been intently listening, you still have an opportunity to submit some questions through the Q&A window. So one question that we have had come through, Steve, is what are you seeing as the biggest barriers to organizations adopting a greater degree of personalization within their plan design?
I actually, what we've seen is it's less on the plan design. I think if we recall the slide that I showed that had the two people, the one running off the screen and the other one cheering. What we've seen is it's less on the design side. People are certainly saying, hey, how do we model this? How do we create fairness and equity in a compensation plan if one person is being paid on a quota or one person is being paid on something that offers cash as the upside and somebody else is being paid on a different plan construct? How do we create that equivalency? So there are some questions from comp designers But I think those are hurdles that they can more easily see the path to overcoming them. A lot of times it is the sales comp administrators that see the bigger challenge, because a lot of times people have legacy systems in place, and those legacy systems are constructed and deployed in a way that makes it very difficult to make these types of changes without re-architecting or potentially looking at different software. So from that perspective, I think the bigger challenges tend to be on the administration side.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And secondarily, for those organizations that do pay on a quota or a target type methodology, from a seller's perspective, they're always concerned about fairness of territories and fairness of patches. How does that motivate or change the seller's perspective into the plan options that they might choose? For example, if I know I've got a very hot or warm territory, I might go for the more riskier plan.
Yeah, it's a great question that ultimately when you're evaluating fairness, the way I typically define fairness is equity of earning opportunity or equity of upside opportunity. So if somebody is in a hot patch of land and says, I'm going to look for a quota that I think I can blow out of the water, I think that's probably fine. You might want to even encourage that. There might be situations, though, where you are designing the quotas, if the company is still providing these, where that hot patch of land is actually going to give them a bigger quota. And so I don't know if that oven by itself is necessarily going to create a better incentive vehicle for them versus something where they would say, I've got a hot patch of land. If I can exceed or excel in my performance measures, then my reward mechanism and what's going to motivate me might be a little bit different than quota upside payout.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. So it sounds like, balancing the risk reward to make that the level of fairness is something that people should keep in mind.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think, I haven't seen any more questions come in. So thank you for your participation today during today's webinar. As we mentioned at the top of the webinar, we are going to announce some winners of Steve's new book, The Sales Compensation Solutions. And we have 3 winners here, Sonia Mohan, Matthew Price, and Sandy Dalakas. We'll be in touch with you following the webinar to work out how to get you those books. So congratulations. Thank you everyone for your participation today. You'll find our slides posted in the resource section, along with additional white papers and research briefs for you to explore about this topic. You'll also be emailed the recording of today's webinar so you can re-watch or share with your colleagues. Thanks again, Steve, for your great presentation today, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.